Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very excited to be here. I think you're all seeing us live. And just to introduce you, this is a panel called A Case for Intersectionality, Revealing the Convergence of Institutions, Systems, and Categorizations in the Fight for Equity. And we'll get, very quickly, we'll get deeper into what all that means and how it's being applied in the organizations of 4 amazing Ashoka Fellows selected this year. But before we do that, I want to introduce you very briefly to Clara Brouwer, who is our panel coordinator. And we're going to start by kind of asking all of you to contribute first to the panel. So Clara, why don't you take it from here?
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Clara, and my role is to ensure that you get the most out of this time with our speakers. And if you have any questions for them, please write them in the chat so I can share them at specific points during the session when Kenny asks for my input. And before I'm now handing over to the speakers, I would like to take us a couple of minutes to, sense the diversity and richness in this group. And a quick question to get us started is that I'd like to share all of you your answer to the chat. What is the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear the word intersectionality? And yeah, I'm following the chat and hand over to Kenny again to guide us through the session, and I will remain available for you in the chat. Is that I'd like to share.
Sorry about that. I had the video on. So again, as Clara said, just as we get started, we'd love for all of you to put into the chat when you hear or think of intersectionality, what comes to mind. And I'm going to read out some of the things that are coming to the chat, also for our group of panelists to just get a feel of what's happening in this virtual room that we're all in. So just a few of the ideas that come in here: groundbreaking, interbeing, race and gender, overlapping identities, diversity, layers over layers, complexity, identities, multiple aspects of our lives, hope, new comfort areas, diversity, Kimberly Crenshaw, of course. And some other things will keep coming into that. So just as we take that, let's just hold that for a second and get started. So let me introduce myself really briefly. My name is Kenny Cluett. I'm the Executive Director of Hello Europe, which is an Ashoka initiative around diversity and migration. And I have the huge privilege of facilitating this panel today. I'm very excited about what's coming next. I just wanted to thank you all for joining us. We'll be speaking again with 4 Ashoka Fellows that have been selected this year. So kind of fresh off the docket, still excited about Ashoka, and we're very excited to learn from all of you. And all their work applies intersectionality in a number of powerful ways, solving systemic inequality through their important work. So as we're going to start out, I'm going to introduce them in a second and ask them some questions. And in the meanwhile, if you have any questions, please put them into the chat or comments or whatever. And Clara will read those and kind of curate those questions. So towards the end, we'll bring some questions in from the public and also throughout the session. And also we have a chat that has been created within the platform for gender justice, for people interested in gender justice issues. It's an open chat where we'll put the link in our chat in a second that you can access throughout the conference and kind of connect with different people. Some of the speakers may be connecting in that chat as well, and speakers from other sessions. So just wanted to make that available to you all because this is a pretty important topic in general and for us this year at Ashoka. So briefly, let's get started. What is intersectionality? Obviously, there's no quick and easy answer to that, but I went on to Amelia's website and stole a bunch of definitions. But basically, briefly, intersectionality posits that all forms of inequality mutually reinforce each other, right? And they must be analyzed and addressed simultaneously in order to prevent one form of inequality from reinforcing another. More simply, for people like me that are a little slower at getting definitions, you think of someone, a Black woman receives discrimination as a Black person and as a woman all at once. And those two discriminations feed on each other. So you can't just deal with one of the discriminations and hope that everything else comes down, right? The big example for me that I hear a lot is, hey, let's lower the gender pay gap between women and men. That normally affects white women, but it doesn't necessarily fix problems for women of color or from different backgrounds. And often it can make it worse, you know? So that's my understanding that I'm just gonna put out there, and we'll go more into depth. But why is this so important? Why is this so important for Ashoka? And I was just thinking of 3 reasons this is a very important topic. First, systemic inequality is one of the most important and complex social problems we need to solve right now. And intersectionality gets to the root of this as it deals with or untangles complex webs of inequality that reinforce each other, including race, ethnicity, gender, sexual identity, etc. And really, without intersectionality as a framework, most of our efforts at solving inequality will quite frankly fall flat. So if you're here, if you're a leader, whether you're a man, you're a woman, whether you're coming from different sectors, if you care about systemic inequality, this is a great place to be, and we're going to learn a lot. The second reason I think this is really important is we're increasingly learning that who tells the story and provide the solution matters. It's not just about having creative solutions, it's about who actually provides that solution and who tells the story. That makes a difference. Too often our personal and structural implicit biases disable us from selecting, listening to, and supporting leaders from the communities that are most affected. This is something, Ashoka, we're thinking a lot about now. There's actually another workshop about this tomorrow that I'll mention at the end. We need voices from the communities to tell the stories and to provide the solutions. Today, we have the privilege of at least 4 of those voices representing many others and telling us how to get at that. So maybe you're here from a leadership position, you're concerned about a lack of diversity in your organization or in the world, listen carefully. They have a lot to teach us about how to kind of shore up that kind of leadership and maybe move aside for a lot of us so other kind of leadership is present. And finally, I would say to Ashoka, our vision is a world where everyone is a change maker, and that everyone piece is really, really important. Because if we just make some people change makers and give them platforms, feeding from intersectionality, we may make it worse for a lot of the everyones. So how do we engage everyone? How do we think of everyone as a change maker? So there's just 3 ideas. I think this is a really key panel for us to be in. And that's probably the extent of what I wanted to say just to introduce this. So let's get started. What I'll do, I'm going to introduce each one of the panelists, and then we'll go into questions and kind of ask them to describe their organization and get a little deeper into intersectionality. But first, I'll introduce all 4 of you, just so you know who's here. So to begin with, I'll start with Emilia. Emilia Roch is joining us from Berlin, Germany. She's the founder of the Center for Intersectional Justice, an advocacy and research organization dedicated to making anti-discrimination work more inclusive and address structural inequalities more efficiently in Europe, more effectively, sorry. She has been recently elected an Ashoka Fellow. She also holds a PhD in political science from Humboldt University of Berlin and Sciences Po Lyon, a Master's of Public Policy from the Hertie School of Government, and an MBA from the Jean Moulin University in Lyon. She has also served as the project director of the German Federation of Migrant Women's Organization and has taught at a number of universities in Europe and the US. Right next to Emilia, or you'll see them soon. I get to see them live, but you'll see them soon, is Sarah Zouak, who joins us from Paris, France. She's the co-founder and director of La Lab, a feminist and anti-racist association aimed to make the voices of Muslim women heard in France. She has also been selected as an Ashoka Fellow this year. In addition to her work with La Lab, she works with the Women's Sons Tour in Muslim countries, which is a documentary series. And Sarah holds 2 master's degrees in marketing and innovation and international relationships and project management. Next, we have Veronica Escalante, who's based in Mérida in Yucatan, Mexico. She's the co-founder and CEO of Fundación Share. I'm not sure that's how it's pronounced in Spanish, I guess Share, or however you want to pronounce it. An organization that facilitates friendships to bring about awareness of the interdependence needed for peace and collaboration. She is also an Ashoka Fellow, and before this work, Veronica led a number of efforts in bridge building across Mexico in her own projects and organizations such as Ashoka and Next Place. She's a member of Red Integra, and she also holds a PhD in social anthropology from the UNAM, a Master's of Applied Anthropology from Macquarie University, and a degree in philosophy from the Ibero-American University. And last but not least, Carmen Georg joins us from Bucharest, Romania. She's the founder and president of Roma, the only feminist Roma organization in Romania and a leading organization in Europe that works in an intersectional way to support women in developing deeper understanding and solutions for issues related to identity, women's rights, housing, and local infrastructure. She's an Ashoka Fellow as well, and she also holds a PhD in political science themed on feminism and Roma women. Before we get started, let me just say something. This is the most qualified panel I've ever led before. There's a bunch of PhDs in the room, incredibly smart people that are also very active. So I just wanted to honor that and say for me, it's a huge privilege to be learning from you all. But let's get started. Let me just start by asking you, what do you do? You know, help us describe briefly, if you can, just in a couple minutes, and I'll call on each of you in turn. What's the main problem you're addressing and what's the new solution you're providing? And maybe a quick example of how it's transforming people and situations. So let's start with you, Emilia. What do you do? Tell us a bit about it.
So thank you so much, Kenny, for the introduction and for convening us all today. I think it's a great panel and I'm really honored as well to be with everyone else. So the problem that we're tackling is the wrong narrative that is told about discrimination and social inequalities. Currently, discrimination and social inequalities are told in a very simplifying way, which upholds systems of hierarchies and oppression. So I'm going to be brief and try to explain how. We explain social inequalities with a focus on individual dimensions of it. It means that we're assigning or attributing these differences and these unequal accesses or unequal resources to individual attributes, to individual intelligence and motivation, hard work. Of course, there are some factors that are taken into account, which are structural factors, but in the mainstream narrative, we're still not there. And the problem is, or at least the problem, those systems a system of unequal repartition of power, of wealth, of resources can be upheld with such a narrative. That's the only way that we can tolerate social inequalities, if we actually believe that some of us deserve to have more than others. And CIJ is trying to shift this narrative, is trying to bring a paradigmatic shift to the way we talk about discrimination and social inequalities, but also to the way we address them. And we do that through advocacy, so classical advocacy, but also, trying to change the discourse in any way. So for example, what I'm doing now today is also a form of advocacy. And then research, so providing a background, a scientific background, and also policy-oriented research in order to inform the advocacy work that we do and support policymakers on this path. And then the last thing is training. This means that we are building multiplicators in all sectors of life. It means that we're working with institutions of the private, public, nonprofit sectors in order to shift this perspective individually and collectively, and ultimately as well institutionally and systemically.
Well, thank you, Emilia. I'm taking notes on some of this stuff to come back to it later. But one thing you said that really resonated, and I think we'll address it a little later on, is how with a narrative we can only tolerate inequalities if we believe some people deserve more than others, if we actually believe and repeat that mythology to ourselves. So we'll go back into that in a second, because I think narrative is a key piece that we'll see repeated. Let me move on. What about Sarah? Why don't you share a bit of what you do and
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Kenny, for the invitation, and Ashoka. I'm really happy to be here with you. So today in France, we have like one of the largest Muslim community in Europe, estimated at 8% of the total population. However, like more than almost 45% of the French people think that Islam is a threat to the national identity. So there is this growing Islamophobia, so this specific racism targeting Muslim as well as our organization perceived as Muslim. And that leads to discrimination and violence, where Muslim women are the first victim. because they are at the intersection of institutionalized sexism and racism. And just to give you one important data, 70% of declared Islamophobic acts are perpetrated against Muslim women. So women are always the first victim, even in the racism. So today, Muslim women are really often denied agency to lead change. Their voices are being confiscated by the mainstream media, by the political institution, where we are portrayed as victim, as oppressed, and Islam will be a threat to the Republican values or to women's empowerment. And with LALAB, we are really opening a new path to defend women's rights by empowering Muslim women to become really active stakeholder of the improvement of their own situation. And we are doing this with three main objectives. The first one is all the work that we do as a community of solidarity. So to renew the solidarity broken by the society through the creation of a supportive, caring, and inspiring community, so that Muslim women here in France can receive support and care and training to live really peacefully with their multiple identities and without fear of being judged or discriminated or violented against. So today, for example, we have more than 500 members at LALAB, where more than 83% of them have regained confidence and feel more equipped to peacefully make their own choices. Then, thanks to this community of solidarity, we are becoming a community of expression and knowledge. So being part of this community allow LALAB members to find the courage and legitimacy to speak up and to take part in the debate. So we are challenging Muslim women's narrative. We are appropriating our own stories, and we are becoming part of a powerful narrative of resistance. So we have created an unprecedented media space for Muslim women, allowing them to have their voices better represented in the public debate on women's rights, for example. And then the last objective is how we are building a community of power. So how we are changing practices and legal canvas and funding mechanism to spark a system change at an institutional level, and how we are making Muslim women actors to create a more inclusive society.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah. Again, just pulling one thing out, you talked about this narrative of resistance, right? And how for many Muslim women, or for Muslim women, their voices aren't heard and others speak about and for them. So one of the major needs is building this, through the community, building this narrative of resistance by, for, and from Muslim women themselves, right? That's another theme I think we're gonna see throughout this. Thank you so much, Sarah. Veronica, why don't you share with us what are you working on?
Hi, Kenny, and thank you also for providing this space and for bringing all of these inspiring women together. So in SHARE, what we do is we aim to transform these vertical, unequal societies, and we do it through 3 steps. The first thing that we do is we work with different groups within a society so that they can become aware of the ideologies within their societies that are maintaining these unequal societies, and how they are personally, through their cognitive process, replicating these ideologies through their prejudices, limiting what they think is possible both for their own lives, but for the lives of others. And with this awareness, with this new self-awareness, and with this ability to be critical of these ideologies, we then facilitate experiences that allow them to question and reformulate those prejudices. So talking about what Emilia said about narrative, what we do there is provide experiences that will allow people to diversify totalizing narratives that are sustaining forms of conflict or discrimination. And once they have had these experiences that allow them to dismantle these totalizing narratives of discrimination, then we facilitate and equip them with skills for solidarity. specifically forming or facilitating supportive relationships amongst people who come from different, diverse ethnic, gender, different contexts of identity, hopefully so that they can collaborate to transform that unequal vertical structure into a more horizontal and collaborative, equal social structure.
Well, thank you, Veronica. And again, just pulling out some of these themes, which I'm really enjoying doing, is that this idea of self-awareness is something I think we're also hearing. There's a need, or you're all talking about a need on the one hand to transform kind of the mainstream perspective, but also with the people that are suffering this discrimination to rebuild narratives, right? And to change their narrative, which is something, surprisingly, Veronica, you do that, if I understand right, bringing different groups together. That's actually where you reconstruct these narratives, right? That's a key piece. Yeah,
as you mentioned, my experience is in bridging people. So we always work with diverse groups or that identify as diverse. And we bring them together. And what we do is we transform the conditions of contact that these groups have, so that they're ideal conditions of contact that are conducive to collaboration versus oppression. So that's what we're trying to do, is reconfigure the way in which different social actors relate to each other, so that we can strengthen the social fabric of the cities and the communities that we work with.
Well, thank you.
Not an easy task.
It sounds kind of scary at moment, and I'm sure there's moments of pure fear in that. Carmen, I'm really excited to introduce you, or let you introduce yourself. Sorry, tell us what you do with Romagna.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. I will just give a short brief about the premises, because usually people ask me, who are the Roma, how many they are, and there is this whole speech that I have to every time give, and which sometimes I'm still thinking and saying that it's not my role actually to do this. So, but there are some social, cultural, and historical premises that I want to talk about. And the first one is that Roma women face multiple problems in society and in their communities. And of course, a lot of women experience this, especially women from ethnic backgrounds and POC women. Issues such as access to sexual and reproductive rights, housing, violence, forced marriages, institutional racism, lack of education, and so on and so on. So these are the kind of structural problems that we as a minority group face. Now, another type of issue that we face is the dominant narrative, Roma, this that I was telling you in the beginning, as this Roma big term, which usually invisibilize the diversity within the group, such as Roma women, LGBT people, and invisibilize them not only in the discursive level, but also from policy and political issues. Now, we have to understand that patriarchal system exists both in community as well as in society, and it's replicated everywhere. So another dominant narrative that it's there and that I want to criticize is the idea that only for when we talk about Roma people that there are patriarchal rules or system, which is not true. Now, having all this inside, I also have to remind as a premises the heritage of a long history of oppression, persecution, and invisibility in all political and economic and social and cultural context. Romania is a particular context because we had slavery for 500 years, which a lot of people may know. We had Holocaust, during which Roma people were among the oppressed. And also, of course, the communist period, the so-called communist period, which banned Roma from expressing identity, language, etc., etc. In all this political context that Roma has been through in this Romanian space, Roma women, as well as other groups inside our ethnic group, has been invisibilized and kept silent. And last, as a premises, is the lack of representation in media, arts, or the overrepresentation of us as Roma in an exotic, wild, closer to biologic and nature. So as you can see, all these premises build the kind of narrative that Eromnia, the organization that I'm running, is trying to counteract and to dismantle through different things that we do. And since we started to work in 2012 at the grassroots level, we have tried not only to change this kind of narrative, but also to work and build with the women in our communities to build a different narrative that is more, that we can relate more, yes? And by working with Roma women, I think that this kind of narrative can be, in a way, not necessarily distanced from, but it can be changed. And what I want to mention is that since we started to work, we adopted a model which is based on community development tools and which places Roma women in the center of our actions, building a grassroots feminist intervention, which we called SORA. It's an abbreviation for study, the part where we do research in the community to find from Roma women what are their problems, what are their needs, and how they see all these problems being solved. And then a form of organization which is based on community development, which we didn't invent, of course, but is based on initiative groups where women meet in a collective way and tell their stories and prioritize and organize in different ways by doing workshops on different topics and in order to increase their abilities and capacities. The next step is to revendicate, which means that women who gather in this collective organization start to revendicate their rights, whether it's in front of the local authorities or communities, and last is to advocate for our rights. So this method supports our work in an intersectional way, making sure that the groups go through all these stages to increase also the internal cohesion, gain power, abilities, and recognition. But also it's a way for us as Roma women to heal our collective traumas based on the premises that I've discussed already, and to build or to reshape our narratives based on this intersectional perspective that I talked about.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Carmen. And just to kind of feed off that, in a sense, one of the things that we've also seen working with, Hello Europe and some diversity things is there's sort of new diversities in Europe that are becoming more evident. And often, just like you were saying, that invisibilizes this horrible oppression that has been constant for the last, 600, 700 years, depending kind of on the country, or 1,000 if you start in Eastern Europe, of the Romani people. And how bringing just some of those issues up and reminding people of these premises, right, or the narratives that circle around this group, and just calling them out and saying, these narratives aren't true. They're not based on anything that's actually true. Let's go deep into them, just how important that is. And for me, I'm just really glad we're able to have your perspective as well in this group, and to not forget about the different groups that have been around for a while. So thank you so much for sharing that and for going into detail. One of the questions, or one of the things I'm hearing from all of you, there's like a theme about how women in particular from underrepresented communities, so Black people of color, Indigenous people, Romani women, etc., how they're often forced in our society they feel they have to choose between their identities, so their culture, their religion, their community, and inclusion or integration, right? Integration, which is kind of a bad word in many of these communities, right? It's something almost negative. And you work for them to be able to be active and empowered without having to give up their culture, religion, or community. I'd love to hear it from some of you, or from all of you. What's that balance? What's the balance? What are some examples of how you beat that dichotomy? How you've beaten that narrative of you either have to give up all your culture and integrate, or keep your culture but be excluded from the system. And any of you can answer, we can go in order again, or if any of you want to just jump in there, what are one or two examples or ways that you're beating that dichotomy, if I can call it that?
Can I start maybe with also explaining why it's a case? So I'm not going to give examples of how to beat this, but more explaining why women are at the intersection and are required to choose. And that's, it's a colonial pattern that is really well and alive, where women are representative of the nation. So, you know, indigenous women, Black women, Arabic women, Muslim women are representative of the power that the colonizer has on a people. And on the other hand, you know, white women are representative of the nation, on the of the strength of the nation. So that's why women's bodies, no matter where they come from, continue to be instrumentalized by patriarchy. And so that's why any fight against the patriarchy, which does not address racism and colonialism, will be vain. It means that as long as women will be used as instruments of power, instruments of, you know, reinforcing and reasserting patriarchal power, nationalistic power, colonial power, we will never manage to overcome oppression. And so in that sense, I think that's a perfect example of how intersectionality works, and that we need to decenter those conversations from individuals. We need to decenter the conversation from what is happening to me as a person. How do I do that? I mean, it's important. We can talk about that amongst ourselves. I mean, I've had this conversation with Sarah many times, and that's really nice that we can do that. But in order to overcome this, you know, like the over, I think we're falling into neoliberal logics when we focus so much on what happens to us as people and what are our tactics, what are our strategies. We don't need strategies. We need to understand the patterns and the logics, and we need to combat them at a systemic level.
Thank you, Amelia. I think that's really helpful. Any other thoughts on this from?
Yes, I wanted to add some things about your question, which really put me a little bit to think, because of this relation between feminism and religion and culture, for example, or religion. And I think it's, in a way, something specific to ethnic women, or, you know, POC women, or in general, women from minority group, as we are not afraid to do this mix and to acknowledge our culture or our religion. And this is something that we embrace because it is part of our identities. And I think, and I was listening to your presentation, to your introduction about intersectionality. And I think the beauty of intersectionality is not only that it speaks about identities, but power structures and how they become oppressive. And when you embrace and how you can acknowledge all your identities and be aware of the different structural power relations that exist and that affect you. And I think what I've built, without being modest, what I've built in Eromnia and along with my colleagues, because it is a collective work, is that we proved that Roma feminism can be compatible with culture, with community interests, with religion and feminism. We work with Pentecostal women, with Adventists, and it really works very nice and very good. And religious women can be really feminist. And we proved that in our Romanian society that this is compatible. And we challenge in the same way the white liberal feminist view of tradition and modernity, you know, because you talked about dichotomy. And for us, for example, it is impossible to choose between this, because it gives us a sense of separation between our identities, our struggles, and our life experience, which are so important to understand our issues and the need to build on a collective work and a community work. And of course, one good example, and I will finish with this, is this idea, for example, of motherhood, as it is framed by white feminists. We talking about the equality and balance at work, at the workplace, etc., versus Roma feminists, for example, or Black feminists, who talk about the everyday struggle for survival. And it's so important to talk and to go deeper in this kind of conversation, and also to embrace this kind, and not to be afraid of marital status, religion, culture, etc., etc.
Yeah, thank you so much, Carmen. I'm going to use that to jump into another question, because you mentioned kind of this going into the communities and figuring out what does their feminism look like, to a degree, right? Not importing, white hegemonic feminism into the community, but kind of saying, what are your issues? And I remember you saying once, for many women in Roma villages, the feminist issue is how do I get water to my community when water is cut off by the government? What does that look like? Which may not be an issue that white feminists in San Francisco are dealing with. And I want to go to Sarah, because I know this is a bit of your approach as well, is how do you apply feminism in these communities? And someone was actually asking you, how do you get these problematic narratives, which are very controversial, and make them happen? How do you kind of make that mix happen? What are you learning from the women in your community? And how is this different from the kind of white feminist approach?
Okay.
It is, I'm assuming that it looks quite different.
Yeah. So first of all, I think that the white feminism approach is clearly problematic, because it's mainly paternalistic and think itself as really universal. So for example, I've learned all my life that religion will be an obstacle, for example, for women empowerment. And so it's, for example, impossible in France to be feminist and Muslim at the same time. So that's not true at all. And I'm feminist today because I am Muslim, and because justice and equality are at the core of my faith. And I really think that white feminism, if they are not taking into account the life and the experiences of other women, and mostly women of color, for example, they will never be true. They will never have like a true justice. So for example, in France, the thing is that they are using Islamophobia with a feminist banner. So it's really practical in France, because this narrative of Islam as a source of sexism allows countries, Western countries like France, to proclaim themselves as feminists without even having to deconstruct their misogyny, and ignores the sexist and racist oppression that Muslim women are facing here in France. They always are talking about the situation in Iran or in other Muslim countries, and that's important to do it. But when we talk about the situation here in France, nobody wants to hear from us. And it's really important to acknowledge that a lot of the white feminism is based on the exploitation of women of color. So today in France, when I see, and Françoise Vergès, a really famous scholar in France, tell us that if white women, for example, are more comfortable at work, or can do like different things, it's because they can count on the work of women of color, of migrant women, of Muslim women, of Black women, who are, for example, taking care of their children, who are cleaning their office very early in the morning or very late in the evening. So this is really important to know that, and to understand that here today in France, for example, but also in Europe, they are setting up a simplistic dichotomy between a Muslim and a non-Muslim citizen, for example, to really perpetuate the idea that the French values are completely at the opposite of the Muslims' value. So today, for example, we are less French if we are Muslim, and today Muslim women are prevented from, for example, working, from voting, from studying, from passing exam, from going to a gym. So this is like the reality of Muslim women here in France. And I will just finish with the really important idea that sexism or racism have a real function. This is not only about interpersonal aspect, it's more about structural power structure, and about reducing the opportunities of women in the society. So the thing that I'm learning today more and more about Muslim women that I'm working with are mostly all the consequences of sexism, racism, Islamophobia, but also other oppression that we are facing daily. It's all the consequences that we have on our mental health, all the depression, the eating disorders, the sleeping disorders, all of this oppression have more than this, like there is a lot of discrimination and violence, but there are like some real consequences on the bodies and on the mental health of the Muslim women that I'm working with. And this is really important to note that today.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think what you're saying, to answer some of the questions that are coming up even in the chat, is hearing these stories and surfacing them, and some of these challenges actually automatically challenges and engages a conversation, right, with across the aisle. Because you're not saying, let's get rid of all women, white women, they can't do it. It's more like, hey, there's some other needs here and we need to build this together, because otherwise it doesn't improve. And actually a lot of your feminism is built on our backs. So let us give an opinion or two. Thank you so much. And I want to move to Veronica, because I know part of what you're doing is kind of bringing those different groups together, not necessarily always around feminism, but around different groups that are oppressed, and the groups kind of empower and different things. What are some of the challenges and some of the keys for success when you actually try, as you've strengthened these different communities, then bringing them together to build something new? What is that looking like, and what are some of your challenges there?
Yeah, just listening to the different perspectives in Europe, and really reminded me, and especially around feminism, it reminded me, sometimes we do this specifically with women who come from diverse ethnic backgrounds. And in Mexico, it's a bit different. In most of Latin America, Carmen, your comment really resonated with me, because in Latin America, what we see is the intersection of class and racism. And so where racism has historically been disguised by class, and you see that nowadays, when you'll see people saying like, oh, no, indigenous, we're not racist because we're all part of the same ethnicity because of colonialism, which isn't true. It was part of the narrative to build the nation, and it excluded indigenous identities. And the state where I am in Yucatan, which is the state with the highest indigenous population in the country, up until 1994, half of the population were Mayan speaking. And from then on, they started being Spanish speaking. Yet Maya was never the official language for this state or included in the education. So when you were talking about letting go of your identity and talking about inclusion, which we call assimilation, it's really assimilation. It's something that, because of the power structure, it's something that you need to survive, right? And so a lot of the people that we work with here, you'll see children saying, their grandparents only spoke Mayan language, their parents spoke both Mayan and Spanish, and then the children are speaking Spanish and are learning English instead of their native language, because their parents are telling them that it's not useful for anything. And it's not useful for anything because it doesn't fit into that power structure, right? And it won't give them that access to those systems that aren't created for them, that are actually created to exclude them and at their backs. So, and when we talk about gender, what's really interesting is when we do bring these groups of diverse groups of women together, it is really hard. We've actually witnessed this. And what we really have to do is support all of the people gathered there to kind of let go of kind of like this self-righteous part of like, oh, I'm a feminist and I've already done the work. And we've had these moments where we've had indigenous women and mestizo, which is what we call the mixed identity of like Spanish and indigenous here in Mexico, identities come together, and some of them, some of this like violent feminist Western perspective of like, oh, no, but if you're in the house, you must be, or if you're a mother, you must be repressed, or if you're not working, you must be repressed, etc. And thankfully, when we bring them together and we're having these conversations, that's why the first thing that we work on is this awareness of the ideology. And I loved what Emilia said, because it really is important that we understand that historical context that brings about these inequalities and those power structures, because we have most people in a society, we internalize, we normalize, we even naturalize these narratives where we think that that is normal, and we think that these judgments that we're making, these and these ways of being, are simply correct or not, and we don't realize that they've been influenced by the power struggles or by the power dynamics, and specifically in Latin America, colonialism, that have shaped these relationships, that have shaped the way that we view things. And so what becomes really beautiful is that moment where people come together and where you see that change of perspective of like, oh, wait, if you're an Indigenous mom who's staying at home and who has many children, and you can be an empowered woman. And so, and that's where solidarity comes in. And that's where we're building, when we say we're strengthening social fabric, it comes in those relationships that are healing, that are allowing for people to heal these wounds that have been, that have been hurting and doing so much damage for centuries here. And we do believe in that, in the power of healing through relationship and through the awareness of the bigger systemic structures that are influencing and that are tearing those relationships apart and that are making them violent. And so that's what we're trying to reconfigure. And you see it there. You see it in the specific moments of dialogue where you see people really being open to listen to each other and having that ability of being critical of their own preconceptions and changing them. If you don't have that, then there's no room for empathy or change or anything. In our mindset.
That's so good. You just reminded me of something. I think it's in, I believe it's in Carmen's profile. So you can, Ashoka has profiles on each one of you. Some of them are public, some of them aren't yet, just because we're getting all that into the system. But I think it said that through some of this work, and maybe it was in all of your profiles, I don't remember, but there's also like this intergenerational healing that begins to happen, because people, as they're able to kind of take down that defensive posture of, I have to be this, feminist of this type or this other type, they can go back to their mothers and grandmothers and say, oh, wow, I really appreciate what you've done and how you've resisted throughout the years, even though it looked to me like you were just staying at home and cooking, which was a negative thing. Now I see you're actually A, B, and C. I'm probably not even describing that right, but just that's something I've, in all of your work I've seen, it achieves something almost as like a secondary effect, is building stronger community intergenerationally as well, which seems to be pretty important. We're getting towards the end. I want to move to Emilia. I wanted to ask you something. So Emilia kind of is in all these conversations in many different ways. I'd like to ask a bit of your perspective on the sector, whatever the sector means. What are some of the big challenges in bringing intersectionality kind of to institutions, to the day-to-day, to companies, and maybe tagging on to that, people that are listening here that are in leading organizations or other things, what are some of the first steps that people can take? What's the first thing we can do? And then after that, I want to ask you all, probably to end with this question, is what are some opportunities for collaboration or ways you'd like to collaborate with each other or with others? Just to have you thinking about that question. But Emilia, sorry, what are some of the big challenges and opportunities you're seeing? And what are some of the steps people can take and organizations can take?
Okay, so I would say that the main challenge has to do with the ways we have been doing things. So, the frameworks, the processes that are extremely rigid, because, they've been built from, just a quick second. I'm really, really sorry. My son is here, so that's why I have a virtual background and I have to deal with this. Sorry about that. So yeah, and so bringing change, because any type of change is chaotic at first. Any type of change is creates discomfort, and there is many times a reluctance to just sit with it for a bit and to look at what needs to be changed. So our first reaction is getting into actionism. We want to do things. We want to have a blueprint. We want to, have something to implement. And so that's one of the main things that I say to institutions we're working with. I'm telling them that it's not possible to have a blueprint that is ready to be implemented. It's not possible to implement change or to impact change without first being ready to disrupt. And so this disruption is also very important because it enables us to leave some space to create new structures. And intersectionality means, you know, as you rightly said, Veronica, it's about a complete change of mindset. And anything that has to do with the change that we're impacting in ourselves needs to also spill over the self and go into, you know, wider structures in society. And I think we're confronted with it right now because we see that we have the possibility to create new structures, but we're a bit lost because we don't know what they could look like. And so I would say that's the main challenge. And another challenge has to do with power, you know, because also one of the things that we need to change is power. We have to change the way we define power. We have to change the way, the ways in which we share power, the ways in which we perpetuate power. And also, you know, privileges and disadvantages is also an inherent part of that. And so it requires from us to understand that power, as we have held it so far, is not something that has brought us far in you know, or at least it's something that is making us lack in so many ways. The power, the way we define it today, is not something that is expensive. It's not a value, a virtue that is expensive. It's not a virtue that can help us, you know, bring the best in us. It's not a virtue that can, you know, create more resources. It is something that is based on fear. Because the power as we know it is something that we need to see, something that is not multiplied, but something that is either, you know, if I take your power, I lack power. And that's why we need to redefine it in a way that is radically different in order for us to understand that we can all share resources. And of course, giving up privileges also means losing something, but what we're losing can make us gain in other aspects. We are focused in our capitalistic world, which is based on all this oppression, on this oppression and on the hierarchy. And in this capitalistic world, we are convinced that the only good that we can have, the only resources that we can gain are material resources. And this is the sense in which we need to expand a little bit our understanding.
Man, that's so good. And I think you know exactly who you're speaking to too. I mean, you know Ashoka quite well, because those are probably two of the hardest things for a community of change makers and social entrepreneurs to deal with, right? The first, to not jump to activism or to doing something, but just sit with something and sit with something that's uncomfortable and sad and requires lament and mourning, you know, before you actually get up and change something. For me, certainly that's a struggle. And I know for most of our listeners, that probably is a struggle, to just sit with the truth for a while. And let that guide you. And secondly, this power issue, right? Which some people have started addressing in the social entrepreneurship sector, like Anand Giran Khadaras in the US, who kind of says, we're now turning the sector into giving the tools and the power to the people that have ruined the system to fix it. With the same tools, it's not gonna work. You know, you have to actually let go of that power and let some leaders emerge from places where we haven't allowed them to emerge up until now. So just to kind of receive that as a social entrepreneur and say, man, those are tough truths, but thank you so much for sharing them so directly. So let me just do a quick round as we end. There's a few other questions. I'd encourage you all to jump into this chat on gender justice if you're interested in pursuing more of these things and hearing more about the solutions and the way each one of you have worked through this. But let me ask you something really quick. As you hear each other and as you engage in the Ashoka Network, what are some areas that you're excited or looking forward to collaborate on? Or in some of your cases, how are you already collaborating? Because I know you're all working together in different areas. And feel free to just jump in. Here, I'll call you because you're also nice to each other.
I'm going to start, and I'm going to say this is so typical of an all-woman panel. You know, like all of us being so courteous to each other and not wanting to take up too much space. But yeah, while my child is quiet, I'm going to go and say that I'm really looking forward to, yeah, I mean, we are in some ways already, I mean, working with each other. I mean, now I'm just speaking about Sarah, but also on an interpersonal way in, you know, supporting each other because it can feel very lonely to be in that position and also located at that very intersection. And so that's why it's very valuable to know that there's this support out there. And then, of course, when we have the possibility to work on joint campaigns or projects, that's even better. And that's really wonderful to see how we can multiply as well our resources and our scope and our reach. So that's really wonderful. And I'm really also looking forward to knowing Carmen and Veronica better, because I think that there are a lot of synergies that could be done in our respective fields. And you know, nowadays, distance doesn't really matter. We can do so much online. So that's why I'm really, really looking forward to that. And I want to thank everyone for being so generous in sharing your experiences and viewpoints. And I'm going to stop now.
Thanks. Veronica, why don't you go ahead, because you had prepared to speak too.
Thank you. I think for us, we always work in partnership or collaborating with partner organizations that are working with these different groups or that identify as different groups and that are working with them continuously. So being part of the Ashoka network, we've already started working with, last week we just had a panel with, and he's training our volunteers now, this fellow who works with men so that men can become allies. And so, you know, we're working with him, we're working with different partner organizations and reaching out to different fellows. And I am just so honored to be part of this panel and listening to all the groups that you're working with within Europe. I know that I'm a bit far away, but as Emilia says, nowadays there's a lot, and we are working completely virtually right now. So for us, because I mean, we're called Share for a reason. So the whole thing is connecting people who come from different backgrounds so that we can have a space where we can get to know each other, experience, have this experiential learning where we can value each other's differences and generate these human connections. And so I'm really looking forward to reaching out to all of you again and to keep getting to know you and the wonderful work that you do. So thank you for bringing us together.
Thanks, Veronica. Carmen, why don't you go?
Yes. I think all of us share a lot of common values, and this already supports our work and our intersections that I hope that we will build. As Emilia said, yes, distance is just a word these days, as everything happens online. And my hope is that I will meet all of you in another context, maybe created by one of us, because as we try to redefine what it means power through our lens as women, ethnic, or POC, or etc., I think this also takes like it also changes a little bit the idea of what powers means and how is when you create as women this kind of space where you can share thoughts and values and show solidarity. And I'm hoping in future that I will create more bridges of solidarity and sisterhood with all of you, because as I said, we all have a lot of things in common, and this already supports us. And I'm not necessarily thinking of project ideas, because to be honestly, for many years I've been in this I'm working in this field, and I self-identify myself as an activist, but in the same time I distance myself from this pattern of thinking in terms of projects, but more in terms of ideas and visions and synergies and way to build more sisterhood in Europe and also outside Europe with women of different backgrounds. And my hope is that this will happen. I already met Sarah in Vienna this year, and we already shared a lot of things together. And I hope I will meet all of you to produce more feminist knowledge, intersectional feminist knowledge. Yeah.
Thanks. And Sarah, we're right at the time, but please go ahead.
Yes, I would just say that I think that building power is by creating those kind of alliances with other feminist and anti-racist organizations, for example. So yes, for me, it's really an honor to be sharing the panel with all of you. And I know that I know for sure that we will work together. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you all so much. I know we're right on the time. That I know at least Emilia is going to be in one other panel, and I just shared that in the chat. That there's a few others going on. You may find them in other places, but please feel free to check out their profiles, to read more about them, and to continue to engage in this conversation that's so fascinating. And I think I'll stop at that because we've gone right to the time, and hopefully we get to re-engage these conversations in the upcoming weeks and months. Thank you so much
Thank you.
for joining. Thank you so much for the four of you. This has been amazing. Have a great day. Bye, everyone.
Bye.